Welcome to Chapter 7 review. So this one is going to be also going over the acid-base information again, as well as covering the CO2 curve and sort of the relationship with how CO2 gets transported in the blood. Now this is a little more of a linear relationship when we talk about how the hemoglobin and CO2 work together compared to the oxygen and hemoglobin, how they work together. So it's a little bit different. So I do have some resources available, so please check out the resources to sort of explain a little bit better. Even have a little packet where I talk about simply stated, and I have some pictures in there. So please utilize that packet, utilize the resources as well, and then we'll go over some blood gases and do some examples, and then just make sure you're ready to go with the basics of blood gas evaluation. So let's get started. So we'll start with the CO2 dissociation curve, or the CO2 transport. So the CO2 transport, it has much more ways that CO2 can be transported in your bloodstream than there is with oxygen. So with oxygen, you only had two ways. You had either bound to the hemoglobin molecule or in the plasma, right? Dissolved in the plasma is still exerting pressure. With CO2 transport, you have 6 ways. You have 3 ways in the plasma and 3 ways on the red blood cell, so to speak. So when we're looking at this, let's look at the first point here. At rest, metabolic oxygen consumption. So this is how much oxygen your body consumes per minute, right? So you already know this. This is your VO2. This is about 250 mLs of O2 per minute. So 250, there you go, 250 mLs of O2 per minute. So as your body consumes this oxygen, your cells metabolize it, right? And then they produce about 200 mLs of CO2 per minute. So you consume 250 mLs of oxygen per minute, and you produce 200 mLs of CO2 per minute. And when we're looking at this ultimately, when we look at the alveolar air equation, you know how you subtract PaCO2 times 1.25? So this whole thing here, mathematically, realistically, we're actually not dividing, or we're not multiplying by 1.25, and we can, it's just easier for us to multiply by 1.25, but realistically, you're actually dividing by 0.8. So you might see in some equations out there in a book or on the internet, some respiratory equations, especially that have the alveolar air equation taking the CO2 over 0.8. So mathematically, dividing by 0.8 or multiplying by 1.25 is the same thing. So just most people choose to multiply by 1.25. So why do I bring this up? Where does that 0.8 come from? Well, 0.8 comes from the sort of your metabolic rate. So when you do 250 and 200, that's 80%, right? So that's the 80% that gets done there. So that's where it's that 0.8 comes from. And we'll go over that more in the VQ lecture. Don't worry about it right now, but I just want to sort of bring up, if you're looking at equations out there on the internet somewhere, or see it in one of your books, where it uses the alveolar air equation where it divides by 0.8 instead of multiply by 1.25, this is sort of where it comes from. So we'll get going here with some of the other stuff, but we'll come back to this again in the VQ lecture. So CO2 on that third point there, CO2 is transported from the tissues to the lungs. Should say the lungs. 6 different ways. I already talked about this one. You have 3 different ways that it gets transported in the plasma, and 3 different ways it gets transported on the red blood cell. So that we're less hemoglobin specific here, and we'll talk about that in a second. Most of the CO2 that gets produced at the tissue is carried to the lungs. So who does most of the carrying? You know how we talked about between the hemoglobin and the plasma, who carries most of the oxygen? Well, when we're looking at CO2, who carries most of the CO2 to the lungs, right? Who does the bulk work? How do we get most of that CO2 from our tissues out of our body? Well, in this case, it's mostly carried to the lungs in the form of bicarb. So I'm just going to do HCO. 3 minus, in the form of bicarb. So bicarb actually does most of the carrying. And then when we talk about the hamburger phenomenon, that will make a little bit more sense, or also known as a chloride shift. So hamburger phenomenon and chloride shift are synonyms for each other. I know, the joy of it all, but that way you'll know if you see it in literature, either way, the hamburger phenomenon or the chloride shift, you'll know it's the same thing. And that has to do with bicarb in the carbonic acid equation. All right, so let's start off with looking at CO2 in the plasma. So we know that there's 3 ways that CO2 gets transported to the lungs in the plasma. Well, there's one way is the carbamino compound. So this is where the CO2 binds to a protein, okay, in the plasma. So this forms a carbamino, so amino acid, right? It forms a bond with the amino acid and builds or a protein. So it gets carried to the lungs in the form of protein. The second way is bicarb in the plasma, right? This is in the plasma, right? So this is bicarb in the plasma. And then the third way, just like your P little AO2, is where it just gets dissolved in the plasma. So this is just where it still exerts its pressure. That's where you get the PvCO2 and the so on and so forth, right? The PaCO2 and the PvCO2. That's where that CO2 gas molecule is still in the plasma exerting pressure, just like P little AO2. This is P little CO2. Right? So that's your third way. Carbamino, where it's bound to a protein. Second way is in bicarb in the plasma. Then the third way is dissolved in the plasma, just like your other pressures of gases. So when we're looking at this, we have 1% in the plasma that will combine with the amino group and forms the carbamino compound. So this is only responsible for 1% of your CO2 being transported to your lungs, just 1%. So not a lot of CO2 is transferred this way, but some of it does get transferred this way. So that still counts. So carbamino, so bound to a protein in the plasma. The second way, 5% of it will ionize as bicarb, and so this is a good way to do it. So it combines with water, and then with this is called hydrolysis, right? So where it combines with water. So you have bicarb that combines with water with hydrolysis, and then the hydrolysis of the CO2 will form carbonic acid, right? So that's the H2CO3. That's where you're looking at here. H2CO3. This is the carbonic acid equation up here if you haven't seen it. The carbonic acid, when it ionizes, when it goes into its full reaction, will dissociate into bicarb and hydrogen ions. And so when we're looking at this, we're seeing this situation here. We have CO2, and then we're going to add water to it. Right? So we're following this whole equation this way. So once we have hydrolysis, right? Once we do that, it forms carbonic acid, and then carbonic acid will further dissociate into bicarb and hydrogen ions. So we're like, once again, we're going this way on the carbonic acid equation. So once we have that happen, those extra hydrogen ions that are in the bloodstream are then buffered by usually proteins in the plasma. So this is one way. Another way, CO2 will get transferred to the lungs. Now 5%, that's not bad, right? That's a pretty decent amount compared to the 1% that the carbamino compound is. But when we're looking at this one, still that's pretty good. So this is just looking at the carbonic acid equation. Once again, we're bringing it up. But it's a different way that CO2 is taken to the lungs in the plasma. And finally, your third way that CO2 is taken to the lungs in the plasma is going to be dissolved in the plasma. So this is sort of like that pressure that's dissolved. And so this is when we're looking at the pressure that's still being exerted because the gas is in its molecule. It's not combining with anything like we see with the carbamino compound. It's not changing like we see with the carbonic acid equation. And so the percent we're looking at here is 5% as well. So we have 1%, 5%, and then 5% as well. So still we have about 11% total CO2 that gets transferred to the lungs in the plasma. So who's doing the bulk work of carrying the CO2 in the, is it the CO2 that's in the red blood cell or in the plasma? Well, we only have 11% that gets taken to the lungs in the plasma. So therefore, based upon what's left over, you know already that most of the CO2 that gets transferred to your lungs is actually done on the red blood cell. So this does work, it helps, but the bulk work of getting CO2 out of your system is in the red blood cell. So what does that mean if you're anemic, right? So if someone's anemic, their ability to get CO2 or carbonic acid out of their bloodstream is going to be very, very poor. What does this also mean if someone is dehydrated, right? Over here, without hydrolysis, if you have someone that's severely dehydrated, what's going to be their ability to get CO2 out of their system, out of their cells, so that way their body can maintain homeostasis? It's going to be very, very poor. And that's why if someone's in a severe acidosis and they're in a metabolic acidosis and they're dehydrated, one of the things we'll do is give them hydration, right? We need to get them back so their body can work again, and we need that hydrolysis, right? We need that ability to do this. So when we're looking at carbonic acid, and it has it under here, under the dissolved plasma, the carbonic acid, we cannot measure. It's not a blood draw that we can just go draw on a patient here and there. Because this reaction's happening so fast, it's not something we can catch, right? So what we can do is we can estimate how much carbonic acid we have in the bloodstream. And here we just take the PaCO2. So you draw an ABG, an arterial blood gas. That's where the little a comes from, right? The A stands for arterial. So we draw an arterial blood gas, and we just take the CO2 level on the arterial blood gas times 0.03. That's not a typo. It's not 0.003, it's 0.03, right? So this is sort of estimate someone's carbonic acid. Well, we've already talked about this. Where does this come from? What famous equation takes PaCO2 times 0.03 to look at acid when we're comparing it to bicarb, right? So you should have said somehow mentally, if you want to just think about it, pause it, but you should have said the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, and we talked about that a little bit before. Remember, the Henderson-Hasselbalch calculates pH, and it's a way we can sort of check to see, make sure that all our values are appropriate and we don't have an error in the way that we sampled or the way that the machine sampled the blood gas. So let's talk about CO2 on the red blood cell. So we know that 11% of the CO2 gets transferred in the plasma, right? Carbamino, bound, and also in the dissolved in the plasma as well. So 1%, 5%, 5%. So when we're looking at CO2 on the red blood cell, we're going to have a lot more percentage of the CO2 that gets transferred here. So we're still going to have some dissolved CO2 inside the red blood cell, right? We're still inside the red blood cell. Some will get dissolved in the red blood cell. We're going to have some that combines to, hey, a carbamino. It's going to combine to an amino in the red blood cell. And then finally, we're going to have some that binds to bicarb in the red blood cell. So within the red blood cell, all three of these things are going on, okay? So the first one here, 5%, so we're in the red blood cell, 5% will dissolve in the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. So it'll just sort of murk into the red blood cell and just sort of be carried with it. That's why I have this picture over here on the right. Hopefully you enjoyed the references, but it'll just sort of be carried along in the red blood cell fluid, but it's not going to really do anything. It's just going to be dissolved and hanging out in that fluid of the red blood cells. So red blood cells, not only are they great for carrying oxygen and nutrients and all that stuff, but they're also pretty good at carrying CO2, right? And that's an important function. So when we're looking at the next one here, 21% will combine with the hemoglobin to make what's called carbamino hemoglobin. Remember, we talked about carboxyhemoglobin being hemoglobin that has carbon monoxide. Carboxy is hemoglobin that has CO2 attached to it. So that hemoglobin molecule that we talk about where the oxygen binds to it in that site, this is where we have the CO2 binding to it. So when CO2 is bound to it, it's called carbaminohemoglobin. And 21% of your CO2 gets transferred this way. 21%. Now that's a big chunk, right? Compared to what we were looking at before. This is still more. On your carbamino, you still have more that gets transferred to your lungs through carbaminohemoglobin than ever will in your plasma, right? So this is a pretty big chunk of your CO2 elimination system. So what happens here is the oxygen is released, and when this happens, we have these parking spaces that pretty much open up, right? This is the analogy, right? You have people leaving, and as people are leaving, and these people, we'll call them oxygen, are leaving the parking lot, there's all these parking spots that open up for CO2 that's just showing up, right? So as the red blood cell comes around to the tissues, right? So we'll just say this is the tissues. So as the red blood cell passes by the tissues, hey, not only do we have CO2, so I have CO2 in the tissues, but there's oxygen on the hemoglobin molecule. Well, the oxygen on the hemoglobin molecule will dump into the tissues, and as a result, we're going to have open parking spaces for CO2 to jump on that hemoglobin molecule right where that oxygen was. So they're just sort of exchanging parking spaces, so to speak, and I hope that sort of helps out mentally, but hopefully you can relate with that analogy. So this is just normal. This is what happens when you get to the tissues. You have a deficiency of oxygen, you have a excess of CO2, so the both are exchanging parking spaces. CO2 comes out of the tissues, oxygen goes in, right? And it just parks on that hemoglobin, right? And then finally, most of the oxygen, we already talked about this before, so this is a good thing to remember, especially when I repeat things like this. Most of the oxygen, we're talking here about 63% of it, or sorry, most of the CO2, not oxygen, most of the CO2 gets transported to the lungs in the form of bicarb within the red blood cell. Remember, this whole thing is within the red blood cell. Previous screen was in the plasma, right? 6 ways, 3 ways in the plasma, 3 ways in the red blood cell. You do need to remember what percent for what and where it is. So if I ask you about dissolved in the plasma, yeah, 5%. Dissolved in the plasma of the red blood, or dissolved in the red blood cell, then you say 5%, right? So you do need to know these percentages. I will ask you to recall these, all right? So the bulk, or most of the CO2 that gets eliminated from your system, from your body, 63% of it, gets transported in the form of bicarb to your lungs. So what does this mean? If someone has renal failure, if someone has the inability for their body to regulate or produce bicarb, what's their ability to get CO2 out of their tissues? It's very, very poor, and they're going to develop an acidosis, right? Because bicarb is acid or base. Remember, bicarb is alkaline. It's a base. And so this is why it's important that we have functioning renal system. This is why, one of the many reasons why it's important. But we need to be able to transfer and get that CO2 out of the body, get it eliminated from our body so we can live in a normal homeostasis. Okay, so here's where we get to the phenomenon. So when we're looking at this, carbonic anhydrase is going to play a very important role in the carbonic acid equation, right? Do you see me? I circled it. Carbonic anhydrase is going to play a very important role in the carbonic acid equation. So that's what's up here in the top corner. So most of the CO2, and this is bicarb in the red blood cell. So this is very important because, remember, this is 63%. Right? This is a big percent of how much CO2 will get transferred. So this is the important aspect here. Most of the CO2 in the red blood cell undergoes hydrolysis by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. I would remember this. I would totally remember that it's carbonic anhydrase that helps them undergo hydrolysis, right? What happens here is ultimately, we've already talked about this before, we'll get hydrogen ions from this reaction, right? And those hydrogen ions will be buffered by the hemoglobin, right? It's just going to be buffered by it, and I have that resource document that talks about that further. So what happens here is when we have CO2 that undergoes hydrolysis by carbonic anhydrase, it forms carbonic acid, right? And then as a result of the carbonic acid, so we're going this way, remember, we're still going this way when CO2 is being eliminated from the tissues into the bloodstream. So we're in the red blood cell, right? Mentally, you are in the red blood cell. CO2 enters the red blood cell. CO2 goes into the red blood cell, and it combines with water that's already in the red blood cell. That then forms with carbonic anhydrase, forms carbonic acid. As a result of this carbonic acid being formed, it's then going to break apart into bicarb and hydrogen ions. Well, the hydrogen ions are going to be buffered, right? You're going to naturally have that buffering, and that's what we were talking about down here. So we're going to have this buffering by the reduced hemoglobin, by the hemoglobin that don't have any oxygen. So what we're looking at here is CO2 in the red blood cell, once it goes into the red blood cell, will cause an increase in the bicarb level, right? So it increased CO2, right? If we were looking at balancing the chemical equation here for all those that like the chemistry part of this, if we increase the amount of CO2 on the left side there, on the front part of that equation, and we'll ultimately have a result of an increased bicarb on the end of the equation, right? So as a result of CO2 going in the red blood cell, we're going to produce a lot of bicarb. Great. So once there's so much bicarb in the red blood cell, it's going to be like, you know, I like to be at equilibrium within my red blood cell. So if there's more bicarb in the red blood cell than what's in the plasma, it's going to kick out bicarb. Okay, it wants to stay equilibrium with whatever's in the plasma. So if we have CO2 that enters the red blood cell, that usually means that we're going to have bicarb that gets kicked out of the red blood cell. Okay, so I'll repeat that again. Because of the carbonic acid equation, when CO2 enters the red blood cell, the end result is going to be we're going to kick bicarb out of the red blood cell, and this is to maintain equilibrium. Right, because we don't want more bicarb in the red blood cell than what's in the plasma, so it's just going to be kicked out. So once it's in the plasma, remember bicarb, CO3 negative is an anion, right? It's an anion, right? It has a negative charge. So once it goes into the plasma, it sees something in the plasma that it really likes. So normally floating around in your plasma, you have sodium chloride, also known as salt, right? So NaCl, sodium is positive, it's a cation. Chloride's negative, it's an anion. Okay, so once you have bicarb that gets kicked out of the red blood cell, that sodium is like, wait a second, you look new, and it breaks its bond with chloride. I know this is like a sad Maury, Jerry Springer episode, but it breaks its bond with chloride, and sure enough, sodium combines with bicarb in the form of sodium bicarb. So once bicarb gets kicked out of the red blood cell, it sees sodium and it says, I want a relationship with you. Sodium breaks up with chloride. I know this is sad and upsetting. It breaks up with chloride, and you have now the formation of sodium bicarb. Right? So the bicarb is taken to the lungs in the form of sodium bicarb. The release of chloride. So once chloride is broken up from this relationship, chloride is just feeling vulnerable, just got broken up with, and it's by itself in the plasma. Well, is chloride neutral or is it a anion cation? Well, it's an anion, right? It has a charge, and it can't just float out there by itself. It needs to be in a relationship with someone, right? So chloride's sitting all in the plasma alone, just got broken up with by sodium. It's terrible, right? I feel sorry for chloride. So chloride, as a result of its electrical activity, will then decide to move into the red blood cell. right? So, and that will help satisfy its electrical activity to where it's electrically neutral. I know, it's this whole weird relationship thing. Because of this, we have what's known as the chloride shift. We have the chloride shifting from the plasma and shifting into the red blood cell. So it's shifting from being in the plasma to the red blood cell. This is also known as the hamburger phenomenon. Okay, so this is the written word version of this. If we were in class, I would have us act this out. It's a fun thing. We all get to be actors and actresses and whatnot, and it's incredibly entertaining. But ultimately, here's it in a nutshell. Here we have a red blood cell, okay? And then we have, let's just make CO2 purple. CO2 that goes into the red blood cell. CO2 goes into the red blood cell, and as a result of the carbonic equation, right, carbonic acid equation and carbonic anhydrase in the red blood cell, it kicks out bicarb, HCO3 negative. Well, bicarb is an anion, so it needs to have a relationship, and it just got kicked out of where it's going through. So sure enough, over here floating is sodium. Oh heavens. So sodium chloride. So when this happens, this breaks off the relationship between, here, let's draw this. This breaks off the relationship between sodium and chloride. So then we have the formation of sodium bicarb. So when that happens, chloride is then left over here. Oh, sorry, purple. Chloride is then left over here alone. So sad face. All right, so chloride's over here alone in a negative situation. Get it? Because it's an anion. Anyway, so chloride's over here alone in a negative situation, and it decides, hey, I want to be in a relationship, and so the way to satisfy this relationship from me being negative to not being negative is for me to shift from the plasma into the red blood cell. So the chloride is shifting into the red blood cell. I don't know if this picture drawing helps or not. If you have family members or people around you, you can always try to act this out as well. But this is called the hamburger phenomenon, or the chloride shift. We have chloride ultimately making its way from the plasma into the red blood cell. This usually happens at the tissue level, right, where CO2 enters the red blood cell. So, I mean, I'm such a visual person. That's why I have to associate it with like things like the Hamburglar, right? I'm like, oh, it's the Hamburglar phenomenon, because remember, we're breaking up sodium chloride for, anyway, I don't know. It's stealing, and we're causing chloride to shift into the red blood cell. I hope that whole story made you grimace a little bit. Maybe some of you know who these characters are, maybe you don't. I have too much fun with it. All right, so let's get back to the regular teaching. Let's talk about the plasma ratio. So in the plasma, the ratio of bicarb to carbonic acid is normally, you guys should know this is something you probably covered in chemistry, 20 to 1, right? So it's normally 20 to 1. So this means we have, let's go to red, 20 to 1. So this means for every 1 of acid, we need to buffer it with 20 of bicarb, right? That's a crazy amount of buffering that we have to do for 1 of acid. So that's why we need this. We need this. This relationship is abnormal. That's why you see the picture on the left, right? Kevin Hart and Shaquille O'Neal. There's an uneven relationship, right? They're two sort of different strengths going on there. No one's in deficit, just one has different strength than the other. Notice how strong the acid is. You need 20 of bicarb to compensate for 1 of acid. That's crazy. So this keeps the pH level within our bloodstream within the range of, you should know this, 7.35 to 7.45, right? All right, so 7.35 to 7.45 is our normal human pH range, right? The pH of the blood becomes more alkaline, right? As the pH of the blood becomes more alkaline or basic, the ratio increases. Well, what do I mean by that? So in this normal relationship, we have a 20 to 1, 20 of bicarb to 1 of acid. If I say this ratio increases, what if I do a 30 to 1? Is this alkaline or acidic? Well, it's not a normal relationship, so it's either become more alkaline or acidic. So this ratio increased. I have an increased ratio of bicarb or base to acid. So in this situation, I became alkaline. Does that make sense? So I could easily ask you further on, if I have a ratio of 30 to 1, what's most likely the pH? Well, would the pH be acidic or alkalotic? Well, you would say it's more basic or alkalotic because the ratio is increased. It would be less alkaline as the ratio, of course, then decreases. So let's say I have the normal 21. Now I have a 10 to 1 or a 5 to 1, right? That's hardly any bicarb compared to the acid over here. So this means this acid's going to be dominant and we're going to have an acidotic relationship. Our pH will be in an acidosis, right? So what would most likely be the pH if the ratio was 10 to 1? So 10 to 1 means very low bicarb. Remember, the first one is bicarb, the second one is acid. So if you want to do base and acid, if that helps you. If we only have 10 to 1 instead of 20 to 1, the dominant in this relationship is going to be acid. So the pH will be acidic, right? What would be the most likely pH if this was a 40 to 1? So who's dominant in this relationship? So if I label it base and acid, right? Who's dominant? Normal is a 20 to 1, and now we got a 40 to 1. The base we're going to be alkalotic. We're going to be basic in this pH relationship. So hopefully you can sort of see how that ratio works out. Let's talk about the lungs, right? You didn't go into respiratory school not to talk about the lungs. So venous blood, as it goes from the tissues to the AC membrane. Once again, we're coming from the tissues down here to the lungs. So, right, as we're coming this direction, as we go to the AC membrane, right, the chemical reaction that happened at the tissue level to get CO2 onto the hemoglobin molecule and oxygen off the hemoglobin molecule, that whole thing, it's going to be reversed, right? That's why I have, the moonwalk reversed. So everything that happened at the tissue level when it gets to the lungs, as far as oxygen being excreted into the tissues, or oxygen going into the tissues, and CO2 coming onto the red blood cell ultimately, that's going to be reversed. When we get to the lungs, we're going to have the opposite happen. We're going to have the CO2 jump off and go into the lungs, and therefore there's parking spaces now opened up for the oxygen to go onto the hemoglobin molecule, which then when it starts to do that, it gives us that cascade, and hence the oxyhemoglobin, or a left shift. So at the tissue, we have a right shift of the curve where we dump off oxygen and we have the ability to carry more CO2. And at the lungs, we sort of have a left shift where we dump off CO2, and then now we have the ability for the hemoglobin molecule to change shape to accept a lot of oxygen. So this is where we're looking at that chemical reaction getting reversed. This reversing will continue until the CO2 is at equilibrium, till that CO2 pressure is at equilibrium, right? So this is just going to keep going until we have the same amount of CO2 in the AC membrane into the blood as there is in the alveoli. So if our alveolar CO2 level is 40, right? So in my alveoli, my CO2 level is 40 millimeters of mercury. And then in my capillary, and I'll draw a purple here, my CO2 level is 45, let's just say. So this will continue to diffuse CO2 into the alveoli until I reach equilibrium. In other words, until that pressure is then once again 40. and that's it, right? It is perfusion limited, right? It's just going to keep doing it until it reaches that equilibrium, and it's going to stop diffusing CO2 into the alveoli. So what does this tell you? If someone's hypoventilating, so let's do another scenario here. Love this stuff, right? Someone's hypoventilating. Let's say their CO2 level in their alveoli is 60. They're breathing really, really shallow. Right? Too much narcotics or something, who knows? They're just breathing really, really shallow. There's CO2 being built up in their lungs. They're not ventilating well. This could also be the case with a severe asthmatic that can't get their CO2 out. They can't eliminate gas because their lungs are so clamped down. So CO2 builds up in their alveoli. So their big A CO2 is 60, and when we have CO2 being brought back to the lungs, and let's just say the CO2 is at 45 still, are we going to have CO2 being eliminated from the body? No. So this CO2 stays in the bloodstream. None of it comes out. It stays in the bloodstream. So now with that CO2 still on the red blood cells, still attached with hemoglobin, still all that stuff, our ability to get oxygen on that hemoglobin molecule, is it increased or decreased? Decreased, right? Because we're still taking up the parking space on the hemoglobin molecule with CO2. So as the blood gets worse, right, now give this another minute. That CO2 as it comes around is still going to be, let's just say it's 50 next time it comes around to the lungs. Still, is it going to diffuse into the lungs? No, right? So this is going to keep happening, and this is why it's so important that you make sure your patients are ventilating. Do you guys see that? That's the big key in that relationship. If your patient doesn't have good alveolar ventilation, I'm not talking about chest movement, right? I'm not talking about their rib cage moving up and down. I'm talking about the ability to get the gas from their opening of their airway down to their respiratory zone, right? If their respiratory zone is being impeded, like we see with emphysema and asthma during an asthma exacerbation, if that's impeded, then our ability to carry oxygen is going to be low. Their CO2 levels are going to build up and build up and build up, and their body systems are going to start shutting down, right? This is a very bad situation, right? So when we're looking at this is a very abnormal relationship, and this is why it's very important. Like I said, you make sure when you walk into a patient's room as a respiratory therapist, the first thing you should look at is if your patient's breathing or not, right? If they're breathing, good job. If their chest wall is moving, right, but their CO2 levels are really high, how effective is their ventilation? It's very, very poor, right? So you need to augment their ventilation if you want to get CO2 out of their bloodstream, if you want to get oxygen into the bloodstream. This is why it's important. If you have a patient and you draw a blood gas and you see the CO2 level in their blood gas is high as well as a low oxygen level, which one's more important? Which one do you want to fix first? Do you want to give them FiO2? Do you want to give them something that increases oxygen? Or do you want to take care of the CO2 first? Well, remember, the CO2 is taking up parking spaces on that red blood cell. So the first thing you should do in this situation where you have high CO2 and low oxygen levels in the bloodstream, get rid of the CO2 first. Once you get rid of the CO2, there's more parking spaces now that open up for oxygen. So the first line of therapy, if your patient's not breathing, get them to breathe, right? This is where we have our machines and all this other stuff, right? Get them to breathe. If you fix that, that will then lead to fixing their SAT, right? You can coin that. If I fix that, that will fix their SAT, right? They'll fix their saturation. It'll be easier for their oxygen to get into their bloodstream and be transported to their tissues. So if your patient has very poor alveolar ventilation, fix that, and then you'll fix the SAT, right? Make sure they're breathing first. Then you can give them FiO2. Then you can give them all this other stuff. But fix that. Fix the ventilation problem. Then you'll usually fix the oxidation problem, okay? So when we're looking at this, the total CO2 transportation of the lungs, and we're talking a normal situation here, right? This is me just being on the soapbox down here, but the normal CO2 transportation to the lungs is about 200 mLs per minute. So CO2, remember you consume 250 mLs of O2 and you produce 200 mLs of CO2. So under normal metabolic circumstances, you send 200 mLs of CO2 to the lungs. Okay, let's talk about the curve. So the oxygen curve, we talked about this one in part 1 there, or in chapter 6, I should say, in the previous chapter. So oxygen curve is S-shaped, right? That's because the hemoglobin changes shape to accept more oxygen. Once oxygen starts binding to it, it's going to be like, oh, this is nice. I'll change shape so I can carry even more. And so it changes the ability for it to carry. Well, since we have 6 ways of carrying CO2 in our bloodstream compared to just 2, this is going to be almost linear, and I have some graphs to sort of show you. This is more of a straightforward relationship because it's not all 100% on the hemoglobin. Remember, most of the CO2 that gets taken to your lungs is in the form of bicarb in the red blood cell. Right, and then you still have bicarb in the plasma that still takes care of some of this as well. So when we're looking at this, because there's more side routes, because there's more options, it's almost a linear relationship. So simpler, hopefully. So this relationship, remember how on the oxyhemoglobin curve, our y-axis was saturation, our x-axis was pressure. Same thing on here. We're going to have PCO2 on our axis, on our x-axis, so it's still pressure, and then on our vertical it's not going to be saturation, it's going to be volume percent, so it'll be volume percent. So instead of saturation, it's volume percent, because remember, there is some that goes to the hemoglobin site, but most of it's on the bicarb, so that's why it's in volume percent instead of saturation, right? We don't look at saturation of CO2, right? So this is the concentration in both the plasma and in the red blood cell when we're looking at this, right? Remember, volumes percent's looking at plasma plus red blood cell. So that's why we're looking at it here in volumes percent instead of saturation. So as the CO2 level increases, right, like 40 to 46 from arterial to venous blood, this is the normal switchover, right? Our CO2 will increase about 5 volumes percent. Right, so this is where you go from a 20 volumes percent in your CaO2 to now, when your tissues use it, you'll go to a 15 volumes percent in your CvO2, right? So as we do this, this will increase 5 volumes percent, therefore that's why we have that change over there. Saturation, the hemoglobin with oxygen, will affect the CO2 curve, remember, because this is all about who's parked in the red blood cell ultimately, who's taking up space, right? If there's too much O2, CO2 won't have anywhere to sort of park and get eliminated from the body. If we have too much CO2, then oxygen won't have anywhere to park and go into the tissues ultimately, right? So who's taking up those parking spaces in the red blood cell ultimately, right? Who knows? This was all about a parking war. Crazy, all right? So if the hemoglobin is 97% saturated with oxygen, there's less room for CO2 to be eliminated or transported out of the body because, hey, look at this. We got 97%, we're not letting it go. Oh, heavens. All right, so if we're left shifted by some reason, okay, we're going to have a lot harder time getting CO2 eliminated from the body. If our hemoglobin on the other side of things is only 75% saturated with oxygen, then we have lots of room for CO2 to get eliminated by the body. So why do I bring this up? Well, in critical care medicine, we've already talked about it a little bit. There's this thing called permissive hypercapnia or permissive hypercarbia. The both are synonyms for each other, and we actually will let the patient's oxygen levels run a little bit lower. We'll make sure that usually their PaO2s are above 55 millimeters of mercury, and that we'll make sure that their saturation is usually at least mid 80s, right, 85% or so, or more, and that's enough for your body's systems to sort of survive. right? We're not talking about optimal conditions. We're talking about just surviving because we don't want to destroy the lung tissue. Well, what's the advantage of this? If we let your body go a little bit lower on saturation, we're not talking about 75, right? In the permissive hypercarbia, usually we're around like 85%. Okay, 85 to 88%, somewhere around that area. And like I said, PaO2 of 55 millimeters of mercury or more. So in this situation, if we let your body's oxygen levels go a little bit lower, right, both in the plasma and on the saturation on the hemoglobin, your ability to eliminate CO2 as ultimately a carbonic acid, your ability to get rid of an acidosis improves because there's more room available for you to eliminate CO2. So if your patient has a severe metabolic acidosis, right, one of the things that might help them is actually making sure that we don't hyperoxygenate, making sure that we actually run an appropriate saturation on them to help them with that. And so when we have a right shift, remember we have an increase of oxygen unloading to the tissues too, remember, because right shift increases oxygen being dropped off into the tissues. So in these permissive hypercarbia patients, we're going to let their CO2 levels go up a little bit to save their lung tissue. But also, if their body's in a severe acidosis, let's say they have a sepsis and it's a massive blood infection, and we're trying to help their pH, trying to help their body eliminate acid from their system, by letting them build up CO2, you're actually helping them get rid of CO2. Isn't that crazy? And you're not destroying lungs at the same time. So you're improving a little bit oxygen delivery. It's not optimal, but you're improving oxygen delivery a little bit because you're right shifting the patient. And then you're actually allowing more CO2 to be transferred out of the body. Even though it's not a normal level, you're allowing for it to be transferred out of the body. So we could have a patient with a CO2 of 100. I even had a patient with a CO2 over 300 once, right? Patient was doing fine systemically because we're running the right strategy for that patient. Okay, so let's talk about the CO2 curve a little bit more differently here. So therefore, when we have a decreased oxygen saturation. So that's where we have a decreased oxygen saturation. This will enhance the carrying or loading of CO2 in the bloodstream. So if our tissues are producing a lot of acid, if we have a lower saturation, it will allow for more parking spaces for CO2 to get out of the tissues, right? Do you see this sort of relationship? So if we have an increased saturation, this will diminish the ability to carry or load CO2 in the bloodstream. So if we're left shifted, let's say we're in a severe alkalosis, or let's say we're hypothermic, right? So our core temperature is very, very low, right? Those will usually cause a left shift. So when we're looking at this, the oxygen saturation will be higher because it's a left shift, right? If their core temperature is low. So they'll be left shifted and their saturation will be high, but their ability to get CO2 from their tissues, it's going to be hard. A lot more of that CO2 is going to stay in their tissues because the hemoglobin's not releasing that oxygen. The hemoglobin's loving that oxygen. It's a left shift. It loves oxygen. It's not going to let it go. It's crazy. So this whole relationship, this is called the Haldane effect. Haldane, Haldane. And I have that resource document, so look under resources. I think I linked it in Blackboard in the content screen as well. So make sure you look for there. I have the Bohr, B-O-H-R, versus the Haldane effect. And so look through that document, see if that helps you understand this relationship a little bit deeper than what we'll talk about here. But what this is doing is it will affect how the oxygen, the oxygen dissociation curve moves when we're looking at this. So this means it can cause a right shift ultimately. right? So this is looking at a Haldane effect can cause the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve to shift to the right. Okay, that's going to be a bad thing, right? So when we're looking at a shift to the left, a shift to the right, unless you are in utero, shift to the left or shift to the right is not a good thing overall, right? Because that means our tissues aren't going to get as much oxygen as they need when it comes down to a prolonged shift in someone's body. So this is the sort of graph I like bringing up to sort of show you guys the relationship between the CO2 dissociation curve. And now remember, this is in kilopascals, so it's a little bit different than millimeters of mercury, but I like to show it because it shows how linear this relationship is compared to the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, right? So down here it is, and it's labeled here, we have CO2 content in arterial blood, or PA, or pressure of oxygen, oxygen. So this would be vein on the top and artery on the bottom here. So, and then V would here be the CO2 content in the mixed venous blood. So, as we move from arterial to mixed venous blood, as our CO2 concentration will increase, but it's a linear increase. It's very predictable. We don't have this whole S-shaped curve that we had with the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. So it's a very linear, very straightforward. Once again, some of this might be helped secondary to having 6 ways to transport the gas instead of 2. This is a picture in your book. It's pretty much showing the same thing, although it's using millimeters of mercury down here at the bottom. And when we're looking at volumes percent on the y-axis, right? And that's what I was talking about earlier. It's volume percent, not saturation. And then it's still millimeters of mercury, still pressure. So the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve down here, you can see how it's S-shaped, right? You can see how this one down here is S-shaped. And here the CO2 curve, there's a little bend to it, but overall it's fairly linear, right? I'm not technically accurate by saying it's linear. There's a little bit of curve to it, but overall, if we had to compare the two, that one's a lot more linear than the oxyhemoglobin curve. All right, acid-base section. Okay, so when we're looking at this, pH is a negative logarithmic scale. I know, it's negative. So it's a base of 10 is when we're looking at logs. So this scale looks at the hydrogen ions in the bloodstream. The lower the number, the higher the hydrogen ions. Once again, the lower the number, right, the lower the pH number, the higher the hydrogen ions, because it's a negative logarithmic scale. So if I have a pH of 5.0, all right, if I have a pH of 5.0, that means I have a ton of hydrogen ions because it's a negative scale. If I have a pH of 9.0, I have very low hydrogen ions. Why they did it this way is above me. So there you go. Yeah, I admit when I don't know something, I like to think so at least. But yeah, I don't know why they did it that way or that. But there you go. So it's a negative logarithmic scale. So the more hydrogen ions, the lower the value, and therefore it's more acidic, right? The lower the number, like what we had here with the pH of 5.0, the lower the number, the more acidic it is. The more hydrogen ions are contained within that solution. So this also means the lower the hydrogen ions, right, or the higher the pH value, the more basic it is. And that's what we have down here, right? I have a pH of 9.0. That means I have a very low hydrogen ion concentration, and therefore my pH is very basic, very alkaline. Neither of these pHs do you want on your patient's bloodstream anyway, when we're looking at that. So when we're looking at definitions, remember an acid donates, so write the word donates. I don't have enough room. Donates hydrogen ions. A base is a substance that accepts accepts hydrogen ions. So this is all just coming back to your chemistry training. And when we were looking at this, the pH is ultimately maintained, and hopefully you remember this from the last lecture. pH is ultimately maintained by the 3 buffer systems, right? The systems when we're looking at this, you have the systems that include the blood, which act immediately. They turn it from being a strong acid to a weak acid. Remember, those were your carbonic acid, your bicarb, and your protein buffer systems. Those were the ones that were in your blood. So those are the blood. And remember, there's 3 little subcategories in there. I would remember those 3 subcategories, I'm just saying. Right? You have your blood. You have, of course, the most popular one in our school, the respiratory buffer system. That's where you can blow off or retain. And then finally, your last one is your renal. Yep, that's where you can create bicarb and excrete hydrogen ions, or the inverse, right? It does 2 things at once. That's the most powerful. And that one, remember, it takes about 72 hours or so, 48 to 72 hours to kick in for that one. So let's go look at those again. Repetition is the key to success in education here, right? The more you go through this, the better. The first line of defense for any change is the chemical buffer system. So the chemical buffer system, and we already talked about this one a little bit here. There are 3 buffering systems of the chemical buffer system that are naturally floating around in your bloodstream right now. You have your carbonic acid, you have your bicarb, and then your protein. So those are your 3 buffer systems that are going on in your bloodstream right now as you doze off listening to this, or maybe you're on a treadmill. Who knows, right? As you're listening to this, these are the 3 things that go on in your body right now. So ultimately what's going on here is you're turning on any of the strong acids that are going on in your body to a weak acid, right? That's what all 3 of these subcategories within the chemical buffer system do. They turn it from being a strong acid to a weak acid. Seems like this is something I've repeated a couple times. This means that the change on the pH will be a lot less significant, ultimately. So it's not going to completely neutralize any changes in the pH. It's just going to help reduce the significance of the change. The next one that I want to look at here is rehash the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. I could not find any pictures of Henderson-Hasselbalch, but this is the closest I could do, so you'll just have to deal with it. Hopefully you all know who this guy, you guys all know who this guy is. Closest I can get to Hasselbalch, but when we're looking at this, the Henderson-Hasselbalch is looking at pH. Right? And this helps us calculate pH by looking at what's going on in the bloodstream. And ultimately what we're doing, and this is looking at the plasma, right? We're comparing bicarb to acid. Right? Remember, it's normally a 20-to-1 relationship here. So we can do this. We can actually calculate what someone's pH is supposed to be, and this is a useful situation, especially if we have an electrode on the blood gas machine. The SANS electrode is what looks at pH. The SANS electrode just might need to be recalibrated or cleaned or something like that, right? But if you have a situation where you're looking at a blood gas and everything looks off except for the pH, maybe this is a good situation to plug in Mr. Henderson-Hasselbalch's equation, right? So what's the normal ratio? There shouldn't be an N there. I don't know why there's an N there. What's the normal ratio of bicarb to carbonic acid? Well, I actually already answered that for you. My bad. So it's normally a 20-to-1 ratio. So when this ratio changes, what happens to our pH, right? That's where the pH will either go up or down. So let me ask you another question. So notice that this isn't the first time I've posed a question similar to this. I have a patient that has a ratio of 12 to 1. Um, how would this be acidic? Would this be basic? Would this be normal? Well, I know from approaching this problem that a normal relationship is 20 to 1. So this is 20 of bicarb, and I'll put a B here just to make myself sure of what I'm doing, and an A over here for acid for the 1, right? So I have a lot less base compared to the acid. So that means acid will be dominant in this relationship. And so a 12 to 1 relationship would equal an acidosis. Does everyone sort of see where I got there? Is there a way I can calculate carbonic acid? Because we can't measure H2CO3, right? We can't measure this guy here. So is there a way we can calculate that if we have to do this? So of course there is. We've already talked about it. Remember, we take the PaCO2 times 0.03. We'll substitute for the carbonic acid part of that. Bicarb, we get that off of the blood gas or from the serum bicarb if they're drawing a serum bicarb on that patient. And so we'll compare the bicarb over the carbonic acid, which is PaCO2 times 0.03. And yes, I have done this equation before in clinical practice, and it worked out. And then I've done it before too, where it actually worked out where it's the same pH as what I was seeing that the electrode was within calibration. It was something else that was going on. It spurred me to look at their electrolytes, and that's further on down the road than where you guys are now. But I thought it's a pretty valuable thing just to know, a tool to have in your respiratory toolbox, right? If you do a little respiratory toolbox list of equations, this would be one that I thought was very valuable. So if you want to put in there why you would use this equation next to your respiratory toolbox, like, hey, pH looks weird and everything else doesn't, right? Or so that's something that you could put in there. All right, so let's talk about the respiratory compensation here. And hopefully these sort of scenarios on the left will help you out. It might be dated at this point, but that's just me, I guess. When we're looking at this, we're looking at the respiratory system acting within minutes, right? Acts within minutes to resist pH changes. So it's not as immediate as the chemical buffer system that's floating around in your bloodstream, but it still acts pretty quickly there, within minutes, ultimately. So what it does is it either, this is the second, sorry, moving on. This is the second line of defense. This is the second line of defense to resist pH changes. Your first line of defense being the chemical buffer system. If the chemical buffer system doesn't make it into a weak enough acid where the pH is not sort of buffered, then we go to the respiratory system, and this is where you start breathing hard, right? This is where if you start doing wind sprints, you start breathing hard, right? Your chemical buffer system got used up, and now you're tapping into the respiratory buffering system, right? So what happens here is when you look at this, how does this respiratory system buffer for an acid-base imbalance? So it will either increase or decrease the breathing rate or depth. TH, the depth of breathing. I know, my stylet needs a little work. So it'll increase or decrease the respiratory rate or how deep the patient's breathing. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's do some examples. And I love examples because they always help me connect with the material better. So here we go, Mr. Smith up here. So we're going to this example up here. Mr. Smith has a lactic acidosis. So his body's acidic, and it's built up from a very passionate tango that he did with Mrs. Smith there. As a result, he is breathing, what do you think? Is he going to be breathing slow and shallow? Or is he going to be breathing deep and fast, right? So he's going to be breathing deeper and faster, right? So this will help correct his acidosis, right? His metabolic acid. Remember, his muscles are producing an acid, so it'll correct his metabolic acidosis by getting rid of CO2. right? We're going to help eliminate that and restore normal pH, right? So after this passionate tango with Mrs. Smith, there you go. Okay, let's do another example. Molly Jensen. We're moving over to this one. Molly Jensen, she just seen a ghost. And hopefully some of you get this. She just seen a ghost and is breathing fast and deep. Her blood CO2 levels are going down. So here's Molly, and Molly is hyperventilating over here, and because she's seen a ghost, and I won't go into further detail on why she might be hyperventilating, but there you go. She's seen a ghost. She's hyperventilating. So her blood levels of CO2 is going down. So this means her pH is becoming more. What would it be becoming if her CO2 levels are going down? It's becoming more basic. Right? pH is becoming more basic or alkaline. So to correct this, what can she do with her breathing, right? So she can either decrease the rate of her breathing or the depth of her breathing to allow for her CO2 to go back to baseline. Hold your breath. Or Molly, right? So hopefully those little scenarios helped you out a little bit. One's a hyperventilation, the other one is using it to correct, both of them are using it to correct pH, right? And I'm just trying to give you two scales of what you could see out there. I love those examples. All right, so when we're moving on to the renal system, remember this one is the most powerful. Right? If you're hyperventilating for a longer period, it's going to have the kidneys should start to get into this game because they're going to see that, hey, the first line of defense didn't make it, second line of defense didn't neutralize it, and you're doing this for a long time. So the kidneys, as long as they're healthy, should start producing and eliminating, right, what your body needs to do. So if the hyperventilation for a time period of 24 to 48 hours, you should have the renal system sort of kick in to resist pH changes. So if you draw a blood gas on a patient, so what's the application here? If you walk into a patient's room and they have a severe pneumonia and you draw an arterial blood gas on this patient, and you see their bicarb level is really high, that means that they've been struggling to breathe for over 24 hours. Usually 24 to 40 hours, they've been struggling to breathe. Well, what does that mean to you? That means their body's trying to resist this, and they could be heading into respiratory failure or respiratory fatigue, depending on what the pH is and the CO2 level is on the blood gas you're looking at. So this is going to be your application point here. If you see that bicarb shooting up high there, they've been working hard to breathe for a long period of time, and that's where you got to consider, where are they at with their work of breathing? Are they going into respiratory fatigue or failure, or what we call impending respiratory failure? And that's something we can talk about later. But the kidneys, they're really powerful. This is your most powerful compensatory system. Their idea here is they're going to, if you're in an acidosis, they're going to retain bicarb, right, to help buffer that pH of the blood. And when they retain bicarb, it will allow the pH to become more basic or alkaline. Okay, and therefore if the blood's acidic, it should help buffer that. It should help neutralize that, so to speak, as much as it can. If a patient hypoventilates for a long time, so in other words, in this situation, hypoventilation equals increase in their CO2 levels, right? They're hypoventilating. They're not ventilating very well. So if they've been hypoventilating, like what we see with COPD, the high bicarb level in their bloodstream may become chronic. CHR. Chronic. So this means that someone with emphysema, they never get a break, right? Their body just continually has a higher CO2 level. So that means that for their kidneys, all the time, they're going to produce a new level of bicarb. So at baseline, they're going to have a high level of bicarb just because they have a chronic condition. It's chronically compensating for their respiratory acidosis. I'll repeat that again, right? Listen closely. They're chronically compensating for a respiratory acidosis. So Derek, what does that mean? That means that someone that has emphysema, that someone that has this chronic condition, if you draw a blood gas on them and they could be talking normal to you, their baseline bicarb level could be 30. It could be more than that, and their CO2 levels could be high, right? There could be a CO2 level of 50 and a bicarb level of 30, and their pH could be normal. And this is because they're chronically compensating, right? That bicarb level is high because they're chronically in a respiratory acidosis. And so to compensate, their kidneys are producing more bicarb, right, to neutralize this. So this will allow for, guess what? Chronic compensation of the acidosis. So continual compensation or chronic compensation of the acidosis, right? So this idea here is that we're going to ultimately correct their pH by just producing more bicarb, because ventilation is not an option for this person with emphysema. They're going to do as much as they can, but that organ system needs some help, and the kidneys are going to kick in to help, right, compensate for this. So what happens here if someone hyperventilates, right, for a long period of time? And this is where I put in a scenario like, Derek, where would that happen? Well, every once in a while, if you work in acute care, you might send a patient home on mechanical ventilation, right? It happens from time to time. So you send that patient home. Well, let's say they had a pneumonia while they were in the hospital with you, and you send them home and their pneumonia wasn't quite resolved when you sent them home. So in other words, their blood gas, everything looked beautiful, their ventilation looked perfect when you sent them home, but as they went home and as time passed, their lungs continued to heal and recover. So now the vent settings, the machine settings you had on that patient, are now probably more extreme than what they needed originally, and now this person could have a chronic hyperventilation. Isn't that crazy? So this is something we just need to be aware of for home care. If you're going to work in home care or even acute care, make sure that they follow up with their physician. Make sure they follow up with their home care company, home care RT, and make sure that there's a way they reevaluate those event settings once that patient's at home for a little while and they're further on in their recovery efforts. Right. So in this situation, the kidneys will correct by, well, in this situation, because they're alkalotic, they're going to decrease the bicarb and therefore allow the pH to go up. So this is where their bicarb level at baseline might be really low. So normal is 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. So maybe it's 18, 19, or maybe it's 20, right? So maybe it's lower, and that will allow for the pH, therefore allow the pH to come back up to a normal-ish level, right? So when the patient's pH is returned to baseline, then chronic compensation has occurred. So every once in a while you might hear a blood gas, an arterial blood gas, being described as a chronic acidosis or a compensated acidosis. Those are synonyms, right? Synonyms mean that it's either chronic, where their pH is normal, or compensated, where their pH is normal. They both are synonyms for each other. So if the pH is not at baseline, then this is an uncompensated state. So if you see a blood gas, and let's do another. So pH, CO2, bicarb. So if I have a pH of 7.35 and a CO2 of 60 and a bicarb of 30, then both of these are off, right? A bicarb of 30 is basic. A CO2 of 60 is acidic, right? But the pH is normal. So this means at baseline, I have a chronic compensation of a high CO2 level. You see how the CO2 level is high, and that's why the bicarb level increased, right, the bicarb level became basic to compensate for the acid that's going on over there. And that, when that happened, when the bicarb increased, it made my pH go to a normal range of 7.35 to 7.45. So if you see this blood gas, you look at the pH is normal, but the other two levels are off. So this is CO2 is off, the bicarb is off, but the pH is normal. That's a chronically compensated blood gas, right? That means this patient's had this going on for a while. If you see it where the pH is not, so here, let's do this again. pH, CO2, bicarb. So over here, we have a pH of 7.27, 0.20, it's supposed to be 7. CO2 of 70, and a bicarb of 30. Okay, so in this situation, we're looking at the pH. Is the pH within a 7.35 to 7.45? No, it's acidotic, so I'm going to label it. CO2 of 70 is acidotic, so I'm going to label it. Bicarb of 30 is basic, so I'm going to label it. So when I'm looking at this, I have an acidosis of some sort, because look at my pH. So I have an acidosis. Who's causing it? Well, there's only one other thing that has the acidosis, and that's so this is a respiratory acidosis. So I have a respiratory acidosis, but my pH is not normal, right? However, I know I'm uncompensated, right? We're looking at this last bullet point down here. I'm uncompensated. So now I'm either in an acute situation where this just happened, where I'm retaining CO2, or my kidneys have somehow gotten wind and have started to compensate. So what's going on here? Is my bicarb level normal, or is it basic? Well, it's basic in this situation. So I have a partially compensated respiratory acidosis going on here, right? And this is an uncompensated state. Uncompensated meaning my pH is not within the normal 7.35 to 7.45. Right? There can be metabolic issues, right? A metabolic acidosis, when we're looking at a metabolic acidosis, pH and bicarb are, what do you think? If we're in an acidosis, the pH is going to be decreased, and if it's metabolic, then, and if bicarb, a high bicarb's a base, right? Then the bicarb would be decreased, right? So both of these would be decreased, right? So an example of this would be if a pH was 7.20 and we had a bicarb of 19. That's an example of a metabolic acidosis, right? The respiratory system in this situation that we just drew there, the respiratory system should respond by, hopefully you know this, right? Just like the passionate tango, increasing the rate or depth of breathing. So if our body's producing a lot of acid, or if we lose a lot of base, severe diarrhea, right? We're losing a lot of base. And I'm not making that up. That's something that could happen to a patient. We're losing a lot of base, or their kidneys are malfunctioning, right? We're not able to make bicarb. So how is your body going to respond? Well, it's going to increase your rate and depth of breathing, right, to help correct that. If the bicarb and the pH are low, and the CO2 is high, this is called a combined. If the bicarb and pH are low, and the CO2 is high, this is called a combined or mixed acidosis. So this means everything's going in the direction of an acidosis. All right, what does that mean? Just give me some numbers there, because this might help me out. Okay, so let's do pH, CO2, and then bicarb. Okay, So we have a pH of, let's just say it's 7.0. So that's acidic. We have a CO2 of 100. Well, that's acidic. We have a bicarb of 9. Well, that's acidic. So everything here is an acidosis. All three of these are in an acidosis. And if you see one of these go the same direction, this is called a combined or a mixed situation. In this example, it's a combined or mixed acidosis. Well, what about the other way? A metabolic alkalosis. When we have a metabolic alkalosis, it usually means the pH and the bicarb are both increased, right? So an example, this would be a pH of 7.5 and a bicarb of 30, right? Both of these are basic, right? Bicarb of 30 is basic, 7.5 is basic. So that would be a metabolic alkalosis. Well, how would you compensate by this? So this means if your body's in a severe alkalosis, the respiratory system should respond by decreasing the rate or depth of breathing. Well, let's just say you're in this situation and you're scared and have anxiety, and so you hyperventilate, and so let's say your CO2 is only 30, right? So normal CO2 is 35 to 45, so this is also basic. Uh-oh. What type of blood gas do we have now? Where all three of these are basic, right? Where all three of these are combined, or it's a mixed alkalosis in this situation, or a combined alkalosis in this situation. All right, so make sure you look at your normal levels, right? This is what I always recommend, especially in the first semester as you're getting the blood gas stuff down, is you make a key for yourself, right? Up in the corner of a paper, or you put it in your notes somewhere here, that you make all this stuff and put it into one place, just like we did with all the equations, where I'm like, hey, put it all in one place, write the normals next to it, the normals next to it, as well as your units, right? It will come in handy. So when you're looking at a pH below 7.35, you know you're acidic. And if your pH is above 7.45, you're alkalotic, and you need to have these remembered. And acidosis could either be caused by respiratory issues, right, where the CO2 level is high, or it could be caused by metabolic issues like renal failure, where you don't have enough bicarb, right? So we call it metabolic acidosis or respiratory acidosis, right? We're trying to ultimately assign which organ system is to blame, right? Who's to blame for this pH being off? And then both of these people are like, you are, right? So if you have an alkalosis, this could be caused by someone hyperventilating, right? Seen a ghost. Or it could also be caused by, hey, we gave way too much bicarb to this patient by accident, or something like that, right? So there could be multiple reasons. I'm just sort of giving you quick examples of things that can cause an acidosis or cause an alkalosis. But when we're doing this, when we're interpreting a blood gas as far as everything's going, we want to find out who caused the pH to be off. If the pH is off, who caused it to be off? Right? And then we can work the problem. If it's the lungs, well, then we can help them ventilate more efficiently. If it's the metabolic system, then we can see if there's an infection. We can see what's causing the metabolic acidosis. If they're in a diabetic ketoacidosis, right? We can figure out the cause. We can look towards that and try to work that solution without saying, oh, it could be respiratory or renal, and try to work all of them. We could focus our attention and therefore be more efficient at taking care of this patient faster, right? Sometimes both are to blame, right, as far as respiratory and metabolic, and we just covered this in the last screen. This is called a mixed or combined. And you can invert those, right? Either one can go in those blanks there. Combined problem. So it could be mixed or combined acidosis, or mixed or combined alkalosis. The last adult patient that I had ventilated as of recording this video, He was in a combined or a mixed acidosis. Both his renal system were shut down because of hypoxemia and high CO2 levels. CO2 levels were high, so both his respiratory and metabolics were causing him to be at a pH less than 7.25, and those are indications for intubation and mechanical ventilation, right? Because both the systems are shut down, so let's put him on a machine that's going to help compensate for the acidosis, right? And it was to the point his heart was starting to get hypoxic and starting to throw some abnormal cardiac arrhythmias. And then, yeah, it was pretty well resolved once he started ventilating, right? Remember we talked about before? Once we were able to ventilate, he was able to saturate, right? So we got that CO2 off that hemoglobin. Sure enough, that's when his saturation started to come back up. All right, so make sure you know your normal values. These will be key when you go out to clinical rotation. This is not something you want to reach into your pocket and look at a list of normals. This is something they want you to have memorized, and I want you to have memorized too, right? If I was your preceptor, I would ask you, and if you didn't have it memorized, it would be a sign that maybe we need to look into making sure you got the basics down before doing more procedures. So pH, know your normals, right? 7.35 to 7.45. CO2 level, 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury. Bicarb, 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. You do need to know your hypoxemia levels, and I have this as a document in Blackboard as well. So if a patient's not on oxygen, so no oxygen, we're going to use this category. If they're on oxygen, we're going to use this category, okay? So if they're not on oxygen, you draw an arterial blood gas and you're looking at their oxygen levels. A normal PaO2 is 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury. Normal, right, we're talking NBRC, we're talking about sea level here, 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury. Mild hypoxemia would be 60 to 80 millimeters of mercury. Moderate hypoxemia would be 40 to 60, and then a severe would be anything less than 40. Right? If it was less than 40 millimeters of mercury, they're in severe hypoxemia. Their blood oxygen level is very, very low. So their ability to get oxygen onto the hemoglobin molecule, their ability to transfer oxygen to their tissues, severe at that point. So you need to know if a patient's on oxygen, we're going to add this to the blood gas, right? So the blood gas here will do a pH of 7.20, a CO2 of 60, a bicarb of 22, and a PO2 of, let's just say it's 55 on room air. All right, so they're not on oxygen. So if I were to look at this blood gas, what's the first thing I would do? Well, I'm going to make sure I've written all my normals, which one's base, which one's acid, right? And then I'm going to start labeling these things. I'm not going to worry about the interpretation yet. I'm just going to start from the very beginning, right? pH of 7.20 is acidic, okay? So I know I have an acidosis of some kind. So SIS. I have an acidosis of some kind, okay. The CO2 of 60 is acidic, okay. Bicarb of 22 is normal. PO2 of 55 on room air is moderate hypoxemia. So I have with moderate hypoxemia. Okay, so I have an acidosis. Well, who goes along with this acidosis? The bicarb, which is metabolic, or CO2, which is respiratory? Oh, this is a respiratory. So I have a respiratory acidosis with moderate hypoxemia. Okay, well that's great, but is this chronic, acute, partially compensated? Oh heavens. Well, my pH is not normal, so it's not chronic. So it's either acute or partially compensated. Now remember, in an acute situation, one of these values between the CO2 and the bicarb is going to be normal, the other one won't. In a partially compensated situation, both of these values will be off and they'll be in opposite directions. One will be acidic and one will be basic. So in this situation, only one of the CO2 and bicarb's off. So this is acute, because remember the metabolic system hasn't kicked in here. So this is an acute respiratory acidosis with moderate hypoxemia. All right, because they're not on oxygen. So the solution here would be to get them on oxygen to where we can at least get their PaO2 above 60, right? Per the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Now, what happens here if the patient is on oxygen, right? Let's say they're on 50% or an FiO2 of 0.5, right? Same thing, right? So if they're on 0.5 FiO2 or 50% oxygen, then we are not going to use this mild, moderate, severe category. We're actually going to move to this category. If they're on oxygen, then we're going to look at their PaO2. So this is where they're either going to be uncorrected, corrected, or overcorrected. So if it's less than 60, they're uncorrected. In other words, they have hypoxemia, and that 50% is not enough. So in this blood gas that we did up here, their PaO2 is only 55. That would be an acute respiratory acidosis with uncorrected hypoxemia. All right. If they are corrected, it would be 60 to 100. So corrected would be 60 to 100. 60 to 100 millimeters of mercury. Overcorrected would be anything greater than 100 millimeters of mercury. So that means maybe we turn it down a little bit there. We're overcompensating for something here. All right, so make sure you got your terms. If the pH is off or outside the normal limits, you have an uncompensated ABG. In other words, it's not chronic, it's not normal, it's either acute or partially compensated, right? So this is either acute or partially compensated. Partially compensated means that either the CO2 and the bicarb are trying to compensate and correct for the other one. So if your CO2 is bicarb, so if your CO2 is acidic, your bicarb would be basic. If your CO2 is basic, your bicarb would be acidic, right? They're trying to go in opposite directions to account for each other. Right? It's a push-pull relationship. Hey, you're out of balance. Well, I'm going to try to help balance you out. I'm going to try to help you out here. So partially compensated means this situation's going on, but the pH is still outside of normal limits. Okay? So when we're looking at this, that's what a partially compensated. When we see an acute blood gas, this means only one value besides the pH is outside of normal limits. So down here, CO2. So only one value of CO2 is outside of the normal limits. So let's say our CO2 is acidic and our bicarb is normal. So this would be an acute respiratory acidosis, right? It's acute because one of these is normal, the other one's not. What if our CO2 is normal and our bicarb is basic, right? This would be an acute metabolic alkalosis, right? It's acute because one of these values is normal, the other one is not. So here's my keys to success, right? Obviously, I want you guys to practice labeling blood gases. I'll try to load some worksheets on there for you as well. So the big thing here is right up through normal ranges, like with the hypoxemia levels for both on oxygen as well as on and off oxygen. So that makes sure that you got those levels correct. Put the directions of the acid and base, just like we did in the previous lecture, right? Where I did 7.35 and 7.445, and I put basic over here and acidic over here, right? So make sure you're making those keys, right? So when you're looking at the blood gas, just look at what I did previously. Look at what it is. Look at the pH and label it. Look at the CO2 and bicarb and label them, right? Don't worry about the whole interpretation yet. Take it one step at a time, right? One step at a time. Look at each one and label it. When you're done labeling them, then you can determine if the gas is compensated, which has a normal pH, or uncompensated. If it's uncompensated, remember we talked in that previous screen about it being acute or partially compensated. So you need to find the culprit. Who did this? Who goes along with the pH? If the respiratory is, if the CO2 is acidic and the pH is acidic and the bicarb is basic, then we know it's a respiratory acidosis. If it's the opposite, if we have the bicarb in one direction, if with bicarb's like 9 and the pH is like 7.0 and the CO2 is normal, then we know it's a metabolic acidosis. Or we could even have a situation like what I talked about with my last adult intubation where it was a combined acidosis. The whole body's systems were shutting down, so we had both a metabolic and respiratory acidosis, which is a sign that they've been hypoventilating for quite a while. So make sure once you've done this, then you can add your oxygen, comment on the oxygenation, right? Are they on room air or are they on oxygen? If they're on room air, then we use that mild, moderate, severe category, or if they're on oxygen, we use the uncorrected, corrected, and overcorrected, right? So slowly, just write out your interpretation, make sure it makes sense, right? Don't rush this, right? Watch out for the all normal values on the ABGs. They can be tricky ultimately. So if I write, just make sure that you have your normals. If you are doing what I say up here where you're writing your own key, that will be very helpful to you. So let's do some blood gas examples, and I'll try to load one of these up there for you guys to practice with when we're looking at this. So let's start some of these. All right, so what I'm gonna do here, make sure that you have done the key up in the corner. So up in the corner somewhere, you should have done a pH of 7.35 to 7.45, and then done base and acidic, and then CO2 at 35 to 45, and then done acidic and then base for your CO2, and then 22 to 26, right? Acidic and base. Okay, so you should have done this, and then I also recommend doing the oxygen levels, like your 80 to 100, right, so on and so forth as well. So let's just start talking with blood gas interpretation. So I'm just going to start very simply here and look at some basic blood gases here. So over here I'll just do pH. I'll do CO2, bicarb, all right, and then we'll do oxygen, so PaO2 and FiO2. Okay, so let's start on some basic interpretations here. So let's say I have a patient, I draw a blood gas on them, or you draw a blood gas on them. I like that you thought of you guys doing it. It's going to be awesome. pH of 7.60, a CO2 of 25. Their bicarb level is 24. Their PaO2 is 65. And they're on room air, which is 0.21, right? Okay, now I'll give you the situation. Interpret this blood gas. It's okay, right? It's just like math. One step at a time. Don't concern yourself with looking at the whole thing and knowing the answer straight away. If you can, great. If you cannot, join the rest of us, right? Welcome to the other group that cannot do these things right away. After a while, you'll be able to look at this and be like, oh, okay, it's this, right? But let's start at the very beginning. Okay, pH. Is my pH normal? No, it's 7.6. So if I'm looking over here, that's basic, so I'm going to say basic. And then I'm going to move on to CO2. CO2 at 25. Is that normal? No, it's not. CO2 at 25 is basic. So I'm just going to label it basic. Bicarb 24. Normal is 22 to 26. So I'm just going to label this as normal. A PO2 of 65. This would be, if you did your other thing over here, this would be mild. So I'm just going to write mild. And then we're on room air, so that's why I did mild, moderate, severe instead of corrected, uncorrected, or excessively corrected. All right, so now I'm going to go through this one step at a time. So I have an alkalosis, right? So I have an alkalosis. I need more room here. I have an alkalosis. I'll just write ALK down here. Alkalosis. Who goes along with this alkalosis? So bicarb or CO2? Who's to blame for this alkalosis? Well, CO2 is to blame for it because look, it's also basic. So I have a respiratory alkalosis going on. Now I need to figure out what type of alkalosis. So is this acute or partially compensated? Because remember, pH is not normal. So this is either acute or partially compensated. So if one of the CO2 and bicarb is normal and the other one is not, then I know it's acute. So I have an acute respiratory alkalosis with mild hypoxemia. You guys sort of see how I put that together, right? And this is just practice, 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 right? There's a couple other ways to do it. There's a tic-tac-toe way to do it. Like there's a bunch of these out there. I suggest doing it this way. However, that as long as you get to the right answer, I'm okay with it, right? Whatever way you get to the right answer, unless it's cheating, unless you, whatever way you can look at a blood gas and be able to interpret it, I am more than happy that you got there, right? You can do it this way, the way that I'm currently showing you, or you could do a different way. That's okay with me, as long as you get there without cheating, because you won't have other people to look at these when the patient's in front of you. Right, so this is all about you just practice, and I'll load some practice sheets for you for interpretation. Then we can always talk about those over the Zoom meetings. Let's do another one. Let's do a pH of 7.20, okay? And then CO2 of 75. Oh, this isn't looking good. A bicarb of 30. PaO2 of 50, and let's just do a room air again. Let's just do the mild, moderate, severe category again, right? Okay, so remember, what's the first thing we do, right? Well, let's just go through and label it. Whew, deep breath. All right, 7.20 is acidic. So overall, I have an acidosis, right? ACID. I have an acidosis. CO2 of 75, that's acidic. Bicarb of 30, that's basic. PaO2 of 50, that's moderate. Hypoxemia. On room air, right? Okay. So now I need to figure out, I have an acidosis. Who's to blame for my acidosis? Well, so we're in an uncompensated state. So who's to blame for acidosis? Who lines up? Who has the other A? Respiratory. Darn it. So this is a respiratory acidosis. We have a respiratory acidosis. Now I need to figure out if this respiratory acidosis is acute or partially compensated. Well, remember, between the CO2 and the bicarb, if one is one direction and the other one is the opposite direction, then that's partial compensation as long as the pH is not normal. And that's what we have going on here. We have one being acidic, one being basic, and the pH is not normal. So guess what? This is a partially compensated respiratory acidosis with moderate hypoxemia. Starting to get sort of the hang of this. Let's do at least one more, and then we can do some more in the Kahoots or things, or not Kahoots, in the Zoom meetings or things like that. Let's do this one. Let's do one where we're on oxygen. All right, so 7.38. Uh-oh. 76. What am I doing to you guys here? 42. We have a PO2 of 50. And we're on oxygen. We're on 50% or 0.5 FiO2. Okay. So let's just cross these out as we've already done those. All right. So just like everything else, we're going to go through this one step at a time. So pH of 7.38 is normal, but which direction does the pH lean? So 7.40 would be dead center. So does it lean towards the acidic side, where it's less than 7.40? Does it lean towards the basic side, where it's greater than 7.40? Well, this leans towards the acidic side, so I'm just going to do a sub A. It's normal, but it leans towards the acidic side. Okay. CO2 is 76. That's definitely acidic. Breathe, my friend, breathe. A bicarb of 42. That's very basic. They are basic in the bicarb level. All right, and then a PO2 of 50, right? So remember, it's either corrected, uncorrected, or overcorrected. So this would be uncorrected. Hypoxemia. Okay, so here we go. I have something that's normal right here. So that means it's a chronic gas because not all the values are normal. The only value that's normal here is the pH. So this is a chronic something. It's a chronic something. Which way does the pH lean? Acidic or basic, right? Because one of these is basic, one of these is acidic when we're looking at the CO2 and the bicarb. Oh, it leans towards the acidic side. So this is a chronic respiratory acidosis with uncorrected hypoxemia. Do you guys see here, and there's a reason why I picked this example, right? You see here, we had to look at which direction the pH leaned in this chronic compensation to figure out who's to blame. Since the pH leaned towards the acidic side, then overall we most likely have an acidosis, and that's where we blame the lungs. So in this situation, this patient had a chronic respiratory acidosis with uncorrected hypoxemia. So an example of this, Derek, when would I see this? What type of patient would I see this one in? And my answer, especially on this one, is someone that has COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Chronic, right? It's in the name, COPD, chronic. C is for chronic there, right? So chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, emphysema, chronically hypercarbic, because remember they destroyed a lot of surface area. They're going to have a low ability to oxygenate. So this person, these individuals that have COPD are high propensity for things like pneumonia. So this could be your COPD patient that has a little case of pneumonia, and it's making it hard for them to get oxygen into their bloodstream, and so they might need to go up on their FiO2. Right, so we can do more of these. Email me. We can do examples together, right? And I'll upload those worksheets for you just to keep working on these, right? Take it one step at a time. Don't just, hey, look at the whole thing and be like, okay, yeah, I know this is a chronic respiratory acidosis with uncorrected hypoxemia. If your brain can do that, great. But I want you to break it down one step at a time. Write out your normals, which direction's acidic and basic, and I want you just to label it as you go, right? And that will help you avoid mistakes, right? Just like a pilot before they take off to fly, they're going to do their pre-use checks. They're going to go through all their same check systems. They're not just going to glance at something and be like, yeah, that looks close enough, right? They're going to go through and be meticulous before they take off, and I want you to be meticulous to start off, and then maybe in 5th semester you are able, you've seen enough of these to glance at it and know what the answer is, right? But you're not there yet. At least I don't think that's a common finding from my perspective in 1st semester. So we'll get there. Just be patient, one step at a time. Don't let it overwhelm you.